Okay, so let's start then. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about Trase. It's hosted by the Swedish Soy Dialogue, but in collaboration with the Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy. First of all, we would like to say that we're very glad to see the broad representation of participants from the Soy Dialogue members organizations. And we really are looking forward to have a discussion with you today on the possibilities with Trase. So please feel that you are active and please participate in asking questions and so forth. During the last Soy Dialogue meeting this fall in November, we discussed the potential strategic next step for the collaboration in the network and risk assessment on meat and dairy import, and also mapping of key risk suppliers were ideas that we discussed during that meeting and by several of the groups. And to explore possible ways to address this, we arranged this webinar to learn more about Trase. As an innovative digital tool, Trase provides promising solutions for increased supply chain transparency. And we hope that this webinar will increase knowledge about Trase, but also give inspiration on how companies in Sweden can use Trase for risk assessment and supplier mapping. Trase is an initiative delivered jointly by Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy. And I'd like to introduce you to the speakers for today. So first we have Helen Belfield, who is the Trase Director for Global Canopy. She is core to both the development of Trase as a tool and how it is useful for different audiences, including both businesses, governments, and civil society. And during this webinar, Helen will provide us with the background to Trase and show us how it works. We also have Chris West with us, who is the Acting Center Director of Stockholm Environment Institute York Center. And he leads market engagement work for the Trase program. In his role, he has been Trase's main point of contact for the Consumer Goods Forum Soy Buyer Coalition and UK-based activity around deforestation risk commodities, where Trase has been applied in the assessment of the deforestation risk exposed of manufacturers and retailers using soy in their supply chain. So Chris will talk to us about the lessons from the Soy Buyers Coalition and UK Soy Roundtable, which we think could be of great inspiration for the Swedish Soy Dialogue. Also on the line, we have Emma Golub, who leads on specific engagement opportunities for Trase. And Emma will be fielding your questions today. And before I hand over to our speakers and Helen, just a couple of practicalities. First of all, we will share the slides after the webinar together with a link to the webinar. It will be recorded. You can submit questions at any time during the presentations. You just use the chat box and we will address these questions after the presentation. And we will make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. And during the Q&A, Emma will raise one question at a time. And finally, we will also keep you on mute just to make sure that everyone's sound quality is as good as possible. So I will hand over to Helen to start.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So as Hannah said, Trase is a joint initiative between Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy that was first launched in 2015. It's funded by governments and philanthropic foundations, so in particular the Norwegian government and the Moore Foundation, which is based in the US. So critically, Trase is not physical segregated traceability. It's a supply chain transparency initiative that brings together existing publicly available data sets, including customers' data, to map supply chains at scale and link buyers to production landscapes. So it's data-driven, it's free, and it's an online open access platform. So Trace is a middle ground of supply chains, mapping from producing regions to import markets via the exporting companies. It's more granular than existing multi-region input-output tables or life cycle analysis approaches, which is important because, as you all know, the region you source from in Brazil makes a big difference in terms of the potential environmental and social impacts of that sourcing. But equally, it's not farm-to-fork traceability, which is very challenging, it's timely, and it's expensive to do at scale. And we don't think you need farm-to-fork traceability to make decisions and prioritize management of risks in supply chains. So Trace covers entire sectors. So it covers, for example, all Brazilian soy exports. As I've said, it links companies to places and therefore to environmental and social impacts in these places, such as deforestation or slave labor. It therefore enables the prioritization of risks and the identification of hotspots in supply chains. For example, it would enable a buying company to prioritize farm level traceability in a high risk sourcing region. It's annual data, and therefore you can also understand changes over time. So without Trace, this is what we would be able to see in terms of understanding sourcing from Brazil. With Trace, this provides much more granularity. So as you can see here, Trace maps the flow of volumes from soy producing municipalities. You can see highlighted on the map on the left via the exporting and then the first importing companies to the first import market on the right hand side. As a demonstration, I can search for Germany to isolate direct imports to Germany. And as you can see in a second, I can then expand on this individual supply chain and these specific connections. And I can see that imports are mainly coming from 3 municipalities. And if I click on these municipalities, these are all in the Matopiba region at the frontier of deforestation in Brazil, and therefore a high risk. So just gives an example of the power of Trace to prioritize risks and supply chains. So you can also resize the flows to reflect deforestation risk rather than volumes as well. So it's important to note some limitations here. So Trace only maps to the first importer. Sweden's soy imports, as you know, are mainly from Norway and aren't directly imported from Brazil. So Norway does mainly source from Brazil, although it's an unusual supply chain as all the imports go through Denofa and are quite specialized because they're non-GMO to high sustainability standards. But other exporters to Sweden, such as the Netherlands, also source from Brazil. So to assess the risks in Swedish imports, you need to look at re-exports from other importing countries. And Chris will touch on this later in his more detailed example. So what data does Trace use to map supply chains? So we use publicly available or publicly purchasable data. The backbone of Trace is per shipment records. These come from different sources, so customers data, bills of lading, cargo manifests. And we do have the individual HS codes. So for Brazilian soy, we map both soybeans, cake, and oil. But on the online platform, we convert these to a soy equivalent. It's important to note that the data is different for each commodity and country that we cover, and therefore the model does vary depending on the data available. So we use the best available in each place. So in Brazil, this is excellent. It enables a very data-driven model with the customs data, including information on where tax is paid, and often this is the asset, such as a soy silo, which gives a very strong signal back to that logistics hub where that particular shipment came from. In other contexts, like Paraguay and Argentina, there's less available data, and therefore the model itself is less robust. But in these cases, it can have more value, given that there's less data available in Argentina and Paraguay compared to Brazil. Next. So how can Trace be used? So as I've alluded to a little bit, it can be used by companies to understand and address risks in their supply chains. And we're working with a number of buyers, and Chris will give and speak to this example to use Trase to understand risks in their sourcing. It can also be used to track progress against zero deforestation commitments. So for example, it can benchmark soil deforestation risks and imports for countries that have signed the Amsterdam Declaration commitment to deforestation-free supply chains by 2020. And finally, we see a strong use case in terms of, in its role in linking companies to places, it can support the development of jurisdictional approaches and also provides buyers with information on high-performing places in terms of sustainability. So as a quick example to show the power of Trase to identify priority regions, what you see here are sourcing regions for soy imports to the EU from 2013 to 2017. And what you can see is that although the Matopiba region, which is highlighted in red, only provides 16% of the volume of soy imports to the EU, it represents 85% of the deforestation risk for EU imports. So immediately you can see an area where the EU can prioritise to reduce its risk exposure. So in terms of future priorities, Trase plans to scale its coverage to more commodities and countries. So Trase already includes soy exports from Brazil, as you've seen, but also from Argentina and Paraguay. We also have Brazilian exports of chicken and pork, and critically, their embedded soy deforestation risk from feed. And we also cover Indonesian palm oil and Brazilian and Paraguayan beef exports. So in the future, we'll expand coverage to more commodities and geographies, and we'll continue to annually update the data. Beyond scaling coverage, we will also continue to work with users, including buyers, to understand how Trase data is being used, and also how we can make it more useful. For example, with projects with companies to connect their supplier data to Trase, which Chris will speak to next. So I think, Chris, I'll hand over to you now after that introduction.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Please shout if not. So yes, I'll just cover quite briefly some of the work that we've been doing to pilot the Trase data with principally something called the Soy Buyers Coalition, but also I'll mention some other points of engagement with some of the downstream companies and countries as well, and some of the lessons we've learned from that. So one of the initial pilot uses of Trase and our data has been our work with the Consumer Goods Forum and Proforest, who are an NGO, around the Soy Buyers Coalition. And the purpose of the Soy Buyers Coalition was to establish what we call a coalition of the willing, a group of companies who were concerned about deforestation risks that were embedded in their soy purchases, and who were committed to identifying in a collective sense the key risk areas that are linked to their supply, and hopefully taking action then to improve the circumstances in the places of production to which they were linked. And they were proposing to do that via the support of credible initiatives in Brazil. So it's worth noting that the initial focus of the Soy Buyers Coalition has been Brazil, but that was a decision based on the priorities at the time and also the availability of Trase data, which has somewhat expanded since. Next slide, please. So the Soy Buyers Coalition has comprised around 12 to 15 members of the Consumer Goods Forum, with participation, the activeness of that participation varying across the last year or two since we started the process. It's been quite a flexible process in that we haven't sort of pinned companies to making core contributions, but essentially we've had about 12 to 15 companies actively collaborating with us in discussions and in the provision of data. We've been working closely with Proforest on the development of a simple and scalable methodology for risk analysis, which I'll provide an overview of in a second. And as a result of this work, what we've been doing is identifying a number of priority municipalities that can be a source of attention by the coalition, as well as a number of potential initiatives that could be supported. We were hoping in the latter part of 2019 to move to a stage of implementation, but that's been slightly delayed at the moment for a number of reasons that I'll come back to at the end. Next slide. So under the Soy Buyers Coalition, our analysis has been divided into two main stages. First, we undertook a rather high-level national scale assessment of risk, and this was then followed by analysis which incorporated company supplier information where this was available or made available to us. In order to first carry out the high-level analysis, we had to decide upon the focal countries of import that would be covered. And that was largely dictated by the focal regions of interest or the markets of sale for the companies involved in the coalition. So we ended up covering as importing countries the EU28 plus Norway plus the USA and the imports from into those countries from Brazil. We then used two primary criteria to assess the relative deforestation risk exposure of those focal countries, and then eventually to transfer those to company level. And those criteria were the export quantities or volumes of soy reaching those countries of import, and also the deforestation rates occurring in source municipalities linked to those exports. We had 6 companies in total out of the 12 to 15 that actually supplied the Trase team with information sourced from their suppliers, and that was done under data sharing agreements with the Trase team. That allowed us then to tailor the first tranche of higher level analysis to identify a list of 10 shared high priority municipalities for attention by the coalition. Next slide, thanks. So for a high level analysis, just starting there, here are the results of the analysis of municipalities which supply our focal countries of the EU, Norway and the USA. And we decided to select a threshold of the top 5% of municipalities with the highest tonnage of exports between 2015 and 2017. So we covered a number of years, recent years of export into those countries. And those, that top 5% of municipalities in Brazil is shown in the map on the left. And 78% of the total tonnage exported to our Soy Buyers Coalition countries is exported by this top 5% of municipalities. Many municipalities export very small volumes, as you can see from the figure on the right-hand side. Next slide. And then we did an equivalent assessment of the deforestation rates, again selecting as the highest priority a threshold of the top 5% of municipalities with the highest territorial deforestation rates between 2015 and 2017. And again, these are shown on the map on the left-hand side. Note, for the Soy Buyers Coalition, we decided to look at total deforestation rates in municipalities rather than just deforestation driven by soy expansion. That was a choice driven in consultation with some of the companies and the Consumer Goods Forum, but it is important to note that we can just look at direct conversion from soy as well if we wanted to. Having screened the information, the eventual results of this, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the priority municipalities, but it does change some of them. 70% of total deforestation is concentrated in 5%, in that top 5% of municipalities. So again, a relatively small number of municipalities captures most of the deforestation occurring in Brazil. If we then combine those two thresholds, next slide, please, it results in a division of municipalities into 4 categories, with the dark purple, the top right classification there covering the municipalities which have the highest level of exports to the Soy Buyers Coalition countries and the highest deforestation rates. And that formed an initial list of 58 high priority municipalities for attention by the Soy Buyers Coalition. Now, as indicated on the map on the right-hand side there, those municipalities are focused in 2 primary regions. One is the Matopiba region in the east of Brazil, which is known for having some of the highest deforestation rates in Brazil. And the other region is the northern edge of the Cerrado biome in northern Mato Grosso, again with high deforestation rates also occurring in those areas. Next slide. And if you could just click again so the text comes up, thank you. So in order to try and get down to a more manageable set of priority municipalities, we then utilised the supplier information that we've been sent by companies in conjunction with trace data to refine these results down. And given the differences in data across those supplier data sets, and also the general lack of traceability in soy supply chains, we did not and didn't expect to conduct a traceability assessment. Instead, what we were trying to develop was what we termed a qualified association between Soy Buyers Coalition company and supplier data and the supply chain information derived from trace. Broadly speaking, just generalizing the approach that we took, we first conducted a basic screening and filtering exercise on individual company data to assess the level of connectivity that they had with the initial list of 58 priority areas that I've just summarized. We then re-ranked for each company that priority list based on their information. And then finally, across the companies that supplied data, we identified those municipalities which had shared high rankings. And from that list, we selected 10 municipalities as joint priorities for coalition. Next slide. So this slide just illustrates the type of information that was made available to us by the companies, and that's listed on the right-hand side. And then we tried basically to make connections between that data with the type of information that Trace provides us with. It's worth noting that no company that we actually received data from covered all aspects which are illustrated on the right. Each company had various different levels of information, which depended on broadly the extent to which they had engaged their suppliers on the issue of soy deforestation to date, and also the relative position of the company in the supply chain. So a manufacturer typically would have different information compared to a retail company, for example. For some companies, we were able to obtain information on crushing locations, which were typically manufacturers, and that allows fairly accurate linkage to trace information. Other companies were only able to identify the traders that they were sourcing from, and some companies couldn't even do this. But what we wanted to do in general within the coalition analysis was to provide a method that was scalable and amenable to different types and qualities of supplier information. So the process we went through of screening and filtering was amenable to the different levels of information that we were able to be provided. The next slide. So I won't go into this slide in a lot of detail, but this just sort of summarizes a little bit more information how we made linkages between supplier data and trace. So for example, if we were told the country of sales activity, for example, the markets that the company is selling into, we would screen data from trace only to cover this country of import. That's quite a simplistic assumption. We're just basically looking at and saying, okay, well, the trace data is providing import data into the UK. If you're providing sales into the UK, we assume that most of your soy is derived from UK imports. That obviously doesn't account for indirect flows, and that's something we were thinking of exploring going forward in more detail. But for this initial analysis, we decided to keep things simple and just focus on direct flows. As another example, if a company was able to identify a processing facility in their supplier information, we can make a very direct link to trace logistics hubs, which meant that we would then filter the data from trace down to a level where we were only covering the municipalities sourcing soy from those particular logistics hubs. Essentially, we were using what data was available to us. So we wanted to use the available information, but do so with as few assumptions as possible, with as simple assumptions as possible to avoid the complexity of the analysis. And essentially what we're trying to do for each company is to provide a relatively tailored analysis for any given set of information. I've got some slides at the end of the slide deck, which as mentioned will be shared, that cover this in a bit more detail as an illustration, but I don't have time to cover this right now. As mentioned, after conducting the screening and filtering exercise, each company ends up with a re-rank list from the original 58 municipalities. And those rank lists were then compared across companies with those municipalities having the highest rankings then selected in our top 10. Next slide. And this is the eventual geographic spread of municipalities that were selected in the Soy Buyers Coalition in our top 10 list. Again, most sit within either the Mata Piva region on the right-hand side of that map there, or in the northern edge of the Cerrado habitat in Mato Grosso. So again, we've got most municipalities from our filtering are still linked to those high deforestation risk municipalities. Next slide. So from that list of priority municipalities, the next step was to start to identify particular initiatives that could be supported by Soy Buyers Coalition companies for support. And the intention of the Soy Buyers Coalition was to support initiatives that were either new or well established in locations of production. So ProForest, our partners, our NGO partners who have a presence in Brazil, developed some criteria for screening initiatives, and this was largely based on the specific context of those municipalities when it came to the type of land use dynamics that were being faced in those particular locations. So again, for example, in our initial analysis, if we identified from municipal scale statistics that there were high instances of illegal deforestation occurring in our priority municipalities, then the intention was to screen initiatives for those focusing on controlling illegality in those regions. In instances where municipalities were identifying as having higher levels of forested areas than those mandated by the Forest Code, we identified that those were then of risk of further deforestation on a legal basis, and therefore we were starting to identify initiatives that were focusing on protecting legal surpluses of forests. And we identified initially several candidate initiatives that were initially discussed in the coalition as potential opportunities for support. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, excuse me, however, further scoping of initiatives has somewhat stalled in mid-2019 for a number of reasons. So this is essentially as far as we've now got within the Soy Buyers Coalition. And one of the primary reasons for this slight hiatus was that a lot of the selected municipalities that we'd identified overlapped, as I mentioned, with the Cerrado biome. And in early to mid-2019, a new scheme within the Cerrado was announced, this Cerrado payment scheme, or what's now called the Funding for Soy Farmers in the Cerrado scheme, which was expected to be launched at any time really during the latter half of 2019. That's now been launched. That essentially resulted in some hesitancy from some of our partner companies to actually invest more attention on particular initiatives. Essentially, they were adopting a sort of wait and see approach to see whether they could support the Cerrado payment scheme. And obviously, for those of you who know about this scheme, you'll know that it's quite a high profile and well supported scheme. So we didn't want to preempt the participation in that scheme from some of the Soy Buyers Coalition, and we decided just to pause a little while to see what was happening there. There were some other issues that we did experience, which are sort of lessons for this engagement process. Whilst we had fairly good consensus around the priority municipalities and that process across companies, what we experienced when we were starting to identify initiatives was that there was quite a lack of consensus across companies on the type of initiatives that might be supported, and that ultimately comes down to the particular priorities that those companies had when it came to their own commitments and their own supply chains. And that led to some delay as well on building consensus about what might be supported. And ultimately as well, we also suffered from the problem that ProForest ran out of resource to conduct further analysis on initiatives to help companies make decisions. However, despite all of that delay, there is still consensus that the broad approach that we piloted here has some significant potential in providing linkages between downstream companies and high-risk areas of production and associated schemes that could be supported. And essentially, we have the ability to either connect companies via this process to those activities which may be quite large, like the Cerrado payment scheme, or more geographically niche, depending on the priorities of the companies involved. It's well recognized now in the context of sort of deforestation risk commodity activity that operating in a pre-competitive manner is essential, both from understanding, from the perspective of understanding shared exposure to risk, but also in terms of influencing the supply chains and production processes. And we see similar approaches and activities emerging in the UK, across Europe, and even across trading actors, which are in some instances adopting similar analyses and similar models of engagement. And we're continuing, it's worth noting, we're continuing conversations with the Consumer Goods Forum and Pro-Forest about how we take this work forward as well. So this is still, Soil Buyers Coalition is still active, even though we're in a bit of a pause phase at the moment. Next slide. Just to mention briefly then our activity with the UK. So the UK has sort of an equivalent platform to the Swedish Soy Dialogue, which is known as the UK Roundtable on Responsible Soy. So we were asked in the middle of 2019 to conduct a similar high-level analysis for the UK as we'd done just for the Soil Buyers Coalition. That process identified that there were around 1.5 million tonnes of soy imported from Brazil into the UK between 2015 and 2017. And that was associated with a relative deforestation risk of around 48,000 hectares in that period. And undergoing a similar process that we adopted in the Soil Buyers Coalition, we identified a list of 43 municipalities that could be classed as high priority for the UK. Many of those municipalities overlapped with the 58 identified as part of the Soil Buyers Coalition, and those are illustrated on the map there. Again, illustrating the fact that pre-competitive activity and coalition, not just at national level but across nations as well, could be helpful and would likely result in a shared set of municipalities and locations for attention. Next slide. So another example of more recent engagement that we've been undertaking within the context of the UK is via something that the UK has established called the Global Resource Initiative, or GRI, which is trying to understand options for the UK, both in reducing its own deforestation risk exposure, not just for soy, but across multiple commodities, but also attempting to partner with other countries and actors to reduce global deforestation linked to agricultural commodities internationally. So in the latter part of 2019, the UK established a task force to look at this issue, and that via a series of expert-led work streams is discussing the policy frameworks, the private and finance sector activities, and the monitoring and reporting methods that could be utilised within the UK and within the private sector to measure progress towards those objectives. The Trase team is particularly contributing to discussions on monitoring and reporting, where there's a feeling that our information, the information provided by Trase, might be useful in tracking progress towards those objectives over time. And we're expecting recommendations to be made back to government from that process in February or March this year. And it's quite likely that that will include elements of recommendations around due diligence frameworks, around the identification of priority biomes for attention by the UK, and sort of a recommendation for the UK to galvanise effort around those biomes. There are likely to be recommendations about incentivising the finance sector, particularly in supporting this agenda. And then there are also likely to be some guidance being provided on the type of monitoring activity that could be adopted both in the short term and also developed over the longer term to fulfil those objectives. In terms of some key lessons across those activities, so just summarising now, There's clearly strong collective support for joint action, and that's within the UK, within the EU, and internationally across various consumer goods companies and traders. But I would say there still remains a relative lack of agreement and consensus around what form that might take and what mechanisms are likely to be most effective. And I think that's leading to some inertia. I mean, pre-competitive action itself takes longer to develop, but hopefully it's going to be more impactful in the longer term. I think it's been important to note via this process that each company that we've been engaging with sits within a rather different context. Each company has different individual priorities, different levels of understanding, different relationships with their suppliers, different positions within the soy supply chain. And that means that navigating the process to inspire collective action when risks have been identified has been relatively complicated. But it also means from the perspective of things like trace data, that actually individual companies are likely to get different levels of value out of utilizing something like trace. So many companies that we work with or have spoken to actually have better information in some cases than on specific parts of the supply chain than trace would have, but equally may have other aspects of the supply chain where they know less, and therefore where trace data might come in useful. In other cases, companies really have very little understanding of their soy supply chains, in which case trace can act as a precursor to more detailed analysis that they might need to undertake. It's clear that there are several encouraging initiatives, including the Cerrado payment scheme, that may be transformational in regions of production. But it's also clear that there are other areas of concern, for example, other biomes outside of Cerrado that require quite quick attention. This includes locations like the Chaco landscape in Paraguay and Argentina, but those are receiving less attention relatively at the moment. And ultimately, it's unlikely that there'll be one silver bullet solution to these problems. And therefore, exploring various options in a pre-competitive space is likely to be important. And as I mentioned earlier, that's why we want to continue the work that we've been doing within the Soy Buyers Coalition. It's likely then that there will be value in continuing to use trace data in combination with supplier information and in collaboration with companies. However, it's worth noting that the process of collecting supplier information is fairly time consuming. Some companies don't either want or don't have the ability to share that information directly with us as data partners. And in the UK, for example, there has been a process of collecting more detailed information which has taken place across a number of UK retailers, led by a consultancy called 3 Keel. That was a relatively time-consuming process, and that's still very far from achieving full traceability in most cases. And therefore, falling back on tools like Trace will ultimately probably be important because full traceability in supply chains like soy is unlikely to be achievable. Having said that, we can get, as mentioned by Helen earlier, a fairly good impression of where the highest risk areas are likely to be just by using trace data and complementing that with a rather simple picture of a Swedish or UK supply chain. And ultimately, there are limited locations which are under highest risk exposure. Next slide. Excuse me. So just finally then, I just thought I'd just comment on the Swedish context. So it would be possible, based on what I've just said, to conduct an equivalent analysis from a Swedish perspective. But the major constraint or factor that needs bearing in mind there, as mentioned earlier, is the fact that actually Sweden does not import a lot of soy directly from Brazil. Instead, most of the soy consumed in Sweden is either re-exported from countries like the Netherlands or Norway, or consumed in embedded purchases. So, for example, as feed going into meat supply chain from other countries like Denmark. We do have in the Trace team the ability to make estimates of such re-export activity or embedded flows, but those rely more on a model-based approach rather than a data-driven approach. So whilst we can make estimates and we can incorporate, for example, the supply chains in Norway or the Netherlands in analysis for Sweden, that ultimately will be less powerful probably than an analysis of the direct supply chain that's been conducted, for example, for the UK. And from an implementation perspective, of course, if we're thinking about acting on the results of such an analysis, it's important to bear in mind that the influence of Swedish companies in regions of production is likely to be relatively small, given the fact that Sweden is a relatively small soy consumer across Europe and across the world. And that's just something to consider, I think, when thinking about what activities might be engaged with and what processes and what forms that engagement might take. So next slide, just finally. Just to finish, as I said, it's probably possible for us to undertake a Sweden-centric analysis using the Trace data. That would require further discussion on the purpose of that activity, i.e. whether that's being utilised to avoid Sweden's deforestation risk or to invest in best practice in regions of production, which is more aligned with what the Soy Buyers Coalition has been trying to do. It would also require discussion around what the scope of that analysis would be. Is the focus just the Brazilian context or the Cerrado, or would there be interest in opening that up to other locations where we now have trace data? There would be a requirement to have a discussion around the methods to use. So would something like the Soy Buyers Coalition approach be sufficient? Or would we need to be developing something a little bit more bespoke or complicated? Particularly bearing in mind, of course, this re-export and embedded supply chain aspect, which is particularly important for Sweden. And therefore, and also ultimately, we want to understand to what extent supplier data is available and could be made available to us in the Trace team, and whether that sort of information is worth incorporating at all initially, or whether just something simple using the Trace data as a standalone thing might be also useful. So I'll leave it there, and yes, open to questions.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll take questions now. Some of the questions have come in through the chat box, so you may have seen them. You can still submit new questions in the chat box if you'd like to do that now, but we'll start with those that we've got already here. So the first question is, does Trace consider that only approved farms can supply beef to the EU and the location of these farms? Helen, do you want to start?
Yes, so on this one, we don't have, so we do include information on which states are able to export to the EU. So the EU doesn't allow certain Brazilian states to export because of the presence of foot and mouth disease. This has changed recently, so we do include that information. We also include information on the export markets that slaughterhouses are licensed to sell to. As well. However, what we don't include, because we don't have access to this information publicly, is the information on the SysBov farms. So that's a traceability system that any exporter wanting to sell fresh beef to the EU has to be registered in the SysBov system, which is farm level individual traceability. We know that exists, and we know the majority of EU purchases of fresh beef come through that system, but we don't have access to that data. But it's important to note that SysBov isn't used for processed meat imports to the EU, so there's still beef coming to the EU, not through that. I hope that was clear, but I'm happy to follow up with a written response as well in the future if that's helpful.
Thanks, Helen. Chris, did you want to add anything there?
No, that's fine. I'm not massively knowledgeable about beef, to be honest, so I'm sure Helen's got a better impression than me.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So then on to the next question. How will the Global Resource Initiative address social impacts? And how can, so let's take that one first. Chris, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I can take that one. So the discussion to date around the Global Resource Initiative, and it's worth bearing in mind that none of this is set in stone at the moment, and it's very much open for further discussion before the recommendations are made back to the UK government on this. has been that, broadly speaking, it makes sense for the UK to align its activity with something called the Accountability Framework Initiative recommendations. So the Accountability Framework Initiative was a collaboration between a number of NGOs that were aiming to provide a bit more coherence around the sorts of impacts and ultimately the definition of what we mean by deforestation associated with some of these high risk commodities. Now, they have come up with some sort of criteria around how they would define social risks, and primarily that is associated with things like the use of slave or forced labor, and also the working conditions associated with production processes. So it's likely that the UK will adopt some sort of commitment around those sorts of things, the sort of use of forced labor and working conditions. Now, in terms of the monitoring of that becomes quite complicated because there is no unified data set that actually covers those sorts of activities. So what we are suggesting tentatively in the GRI is that we take a sort of tiered approach to this, where we try our best to get some high level statistics on the highest risk areas that might be associated with those sorts of human rights problems. And then at a finer scale, when it comes to the monitoring reporting, we would ask companies to actually look at it in their own supply chain in specific detail at particular high risk areas that they might be exposed to, and elaborate and feed back at the national level on attention that they've been putting to addressing those risks. So at this stage, we're not quite sure how we'll be looking at them and addressing them, but that is very much going to be a work in progress in terms of that monitoring and reporting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Question about embedded soy and assessing the risks using Trace for embedded soy and indirect flows. So specifically the risk around meat from meat producers sourcing from other parts perhaps of Europe or even elsewhere in the world, and their exposure to soy risk. Who would like to do it? Helen, do you want to? Chris?
I can start and Helen can chip in, if that
Yeah.
works. Okay. So so I don't need to teach you to suck eggs, but the essentially, as we know, there will be a lot of soy flowing from places like indirectly from places like Denmark via the meat imports. So in terms of actually addressing these indirect flows, the first approach that we would be taking to link those indirect flows to trace data would be to look at Swedish national statistics on imports of different products that we think are going to be associated with soy, and to understand there what sort of quantities are coming from those intermediary countries. So we can get a lot of that information from national trade statistics, either by the UN or from Sweden itself. In terms of then linking that to Trace, what we would need to do is then use the imported soy into those countries as a proxy for the impact that then would be that Sweden would be exposed to. So we'd attempt to adopt sort of a mass balance approach. If Sweden is identified as importing, I don't know, off the top of my head, 10,000 tons of meat from Denmark, we'd look at how much soy is coming into Denmark. We'd make some assessments about how that might be linked to the Swedish supply chain. That would necessarily have to be quite crude because we can't directly link the Danish imports through to specific meat products, which would then be exported to Sweden. We also have the ability to adopt more of a model-based approach. So we can combine trace data with something that Helen mentioned earlier called multi-regional input-output modeling to assess the volumes of embedded soy associated with different sectors of consumption, including meat consumption. That is fairly useful at the national level, I would say, but perhaps less useful at the individual company level, because again, you're not getting a very good direct picture of the direct linkages between the supply chains. So it is a challenge, but there are approaches that we could adopt to try and get around those problems. It would necessitate, though, assumptions that would have to be there, and it would it would be less. We'd have less confidence, I think, in the results than we have, for example, from the UK, where you still have that problem. We still get a lot of imports via the Netherlands into the UK, but we also have some direct exposure as well, so we can fall back on that direct exposure. So yes, there are solutions, but they aren't perfect.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then a final question, which actually leads quite nicely to wrapping up as well and thinking about possible next steps, for which I'll hand over to Hannah. But the final question then is, what if a company on an individual case-by-case basis in a sort of private capacity together with Trace were to look at some of the detail at either end of the chain, so further upstream or further downstream than is currently visible publicly through Trace, what sort of information would we need to add to that picture for a single company on as a piece of work? So a question around perhaps satellite data if it's further upstream, or details about what is known about the supply chain if it's downstream, and what a project like that might look like. Does anyone want to, Chris, do you want to pick that up?
So I think, again, on the upstream side, it really depends, what the purpose of that analysis is and how whether it's being done for an individual company or for a collective group of companies. And ultimately, when we've looked at a lot of the initiatives that we were looking at supporting for the Soy Buyers Coalition, they are very much taking place at the landscape level, and therefore crossing a number of different farms and municipalities, and therefore getting really down to the granular level of individual farms may not be necessary. We also have the constraint that actually making the link between farm scale production and our logistics points is quite difficult, and therefore we haven't attempted to do that within Trace to date. On the downstream side, essentially the sorts of information that we've been collecting from companies to date have described the types of products that are being sold, the intermediate processes of those products. So some of the major meat packing organizations, the feed manufacturers. Now that's quite useful, particularly that supplier information, in terms of understanding who might be the subject for further engagement. So the process that 3 Keel went through was to identify first the sort of first tier supply chain, and then sort of slowly going back through the supply chain to identify the trading actors and the locations that those trading actors were sourcing from. As soon as we can get to the trading actor, we can start to make an association with the trace data. And many of those suppliers will also have information on direct purchases from Brazil. They may have what are called Cert ID certificates from use of certified soy, for example, and that gives us a much better impression about specific sourcing locations. But that's always probably at this stage going to be a very partial, provide a very partial picture of ultimate exposure, because a lot of the suppliers won't have that level of information. So it can help tailor the connections, but it isn't going to be, comprehensive.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So Hannah, back to you then. Really, thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you very much, both Helen, Chris, and Emma. I just want to make sure that there is no more questions. Anyone?
No,
okay, so yeah, so I think I will wrap up then, and of course you can just come back to us if you have questions after the webinar. So yes, thank you everyone very much, and hopefully you have more knowledge about Trace now, and hopefully some new thoughts and ideas on how your organization or us as a collaborative in the Swedish Soy Dialogue can use information provided by Trace. I will get back to you with a summary by mail, including the link to the webinar. And it is, of course, also possible to contact Trase for an individual follow-up if you wish. So you will find their contact details in the mail as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll get back to you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.